They called him Ezra the ox, and the name was meant to mock. At nearly 300 pounds with a round face, crooked teeth, and a body that shook when he walked, he was considered the most worthless slave in all of Chatham County. When the beautiful heiress, Victoria Ashford, pointed at him during the estate sale and declared, "I'll take that grotesque one for my personal amusement," the crowd erupted in laughter. What none of them knew was that the pathetic, slow-witted field hand she just purchased for $35 was actually Elijah Freeman, a fugitive mathematics professor from Philadelphia, and he'd been hiding in plain sight for 2 years, waiting for an opportunity exactly like this. Before we reveal how the ugliest man on the plantation destroyed the cruelest woman in Georgia, smash that subscribe button. This story will change everything you think you know about revenge and justice. You won't believe how this ends. The year was 1847, and Victoria Ashford was poison wrapped in silk. At 25 years old, she had inherited Willowbrook Plantation after her elderly husband conveniently died in his sleep. Some whispered she'd helped him along. With porcelain skin, raven black hair, and eyes like blue ice, she was the most beautiful and most feared woman in Georgia society. Men desired her, women envied her, and slaves prayed to never catch her attention. Because Victoria had a sickness that wealth and beauty had only made worse, she enjoyed causing pain. Not the typical cruelty of plantation owners, the economic brutality, the casual violence, the systematic dehumanization. No, Victoria's cruelty was personal, creative, intimate. She collected human suffering the way other wealthy women collected jewelry. Her previous house pets, as she called them, had all met terrible ends. One had hanged himself in the barn. Another had run into the swamp and was never seen again. A third had simply lost her mind and now lived in the asylum in Savannah, speaking to people who weren't there. The estate sale was held on a blistering August morning. Victoria had decided she needed fresh entertainment, as she told her friends over tea. She arrived in a cream-colored dress that cost more than most families earned in a year, carrying a lace parasol, looking every inch the Southern belle. The auctioneer, a sweaty man named Tobias Crane, was selling off the slaves from the bankrupt Morrison estate. He'd been warned about Miss Ashford's particular tastes. She didn't want the strong, the beautiful, or the defiant. She wanted the broken, the pathetic, the ones nobody else would bid on. "And this here," Crane announced with barely concealed disgust, "is Ezra, field hand, 40 years old. As you can see, he ain't much to look at." Ezra stood on the platform, his massive frame hunched over as if trying to make himself smaller. His clothes were threadbare and strained across his belly. His face was round and plain, one eye slightly larger than the other, giving him a permanent look of confusion. Drool glistened at the corner of his mouth. He stared at the ground, swaying slightly, as if the effort of standing was almost too much. The crowd whispered and pointed. Some laughed outright. "Can he even work?" someone called out. "Barely," Crane admitted. "Morrison kept him because he's surprisingly strong when properly motivated with the whip. Good for heavy lifting, nothing else. Dumb as a post. Can't read, can't count past 5, can barely speak proper English. But he eats like 3 men, so he's expensive to keep. Starting bid, $20. Silence. Who would waste money on such useless property? Victoria stepped forward, her heels clicking on the wooden platform. She walked around Ezra slowly, studying him like a scientist examining a specimen. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her presence, just stood there breathing heavily, that vacant expression never changing. "Does he understand commands?" Victoria asked. "Sometimes," Crane said. "You have to speak slow and use simple words, repeat things a few times." Victoria smiled, a beautiful, terrible smile. "Perfect. I'll take him. $35. The crowd murmured in surprise. Victoria Ashford, one of the wealthiest women in Georgia, buying the most worthless slave at the auction. "Ma'am, are you certain?" Crane asked, confused. "I have much finer specimens available. Strong young men, educated house servants." "I said I'll take him," Victoria interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "Or do you question my judgment, Mr. Crane?" "No, ma'am. Of course not, ma'am." He banged his gavel quickly. "Sold to Miss Victoria Ashford for $35. As they led Ezra away, Victoria's friend Amanda whispered, "Victoria, darling, what on earth do you want with that disgusting creature?" Victoria's eyes glittered with malicious anticipation. "You know how I tire of pretty things, Amanda. They break too easily, and everyone expects you to treat them well. But something ugly, something worthless, I can do whatever I please and no one will care. He's perfect." What Victoria didn't know, what no one in that crowd knew, was that Ezra the Ox was one of the most elaborate disguises ever created by a fugitive slave. His real name was Elijah Freeman, and 2 years ago, he'd been Professor Elijah Freeman, teaching advanced mathematics at a small college for free people of color in Philadelphia. Born free in New York to parents who'd escaped slavery, Elijah had been blessed with a brilliant mind. By age 15, he was solving mathematical problems that stumped university professors. By 25, he was published in academic journals. By 30, he was one of the most respected Negro scholars in the North. But brilliance couldn't protect him from the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. A corrupt slave catcher named Silas Drummond had discovered Elijah's parents had escaped from a Georgia plantation 35 years earlier. Under the new law, even freeborn children of escaped slaves could be claimed as property. Drummond forged documents claiming Elijah was actually a slave who'd been stolen as a child. The law was on Drummond's side. He didn't need proof, just paperwork and a sympathetic judge. Elijah had 2 choices, run or be enslaved. He chose to run. But running wasn't enough. Drummond was persistent, greedy, and well-connected. Within 6 months, Elijah realized he couldn't just hide. He needed to become someone else entirely. Someone nobody would look at twice. Someone so unremarkable, so beneath notice, that even slave catchers would pass him by. So Elijah Freeman became Ezra the Ox. He'd studied the mannerisms of people society dismissed, those with mental disabilities, physical deformities, learning difficulties. He practiced for months, the slack jaw, the unfocused gaze, the shuffling walk, the slurred speech. He gained weight deliberately, eating whatever he could find until his body transformed into something society found repulsive. He broke one of his own teeth, trained himself to drool at will, learned to control his eye muscles to create that asymmetrical, simple look. Then he'd walked into the Morrison plantation claiming to be a runaway from Alabama, deliberately getting caught, knowing they'd sell him as worthless property. He'd spent 2 years in the fields, playing his part perfectly, letting overseers beat him, enduring mockery, eating slop, sleeping in dirt, all while waiting for the right opportunity. And Victoria Ashford was exactly the opportunity he'd been waiting for. Because Elijah hadn't just been a mathematics professor. His real passion, his secret work, had been documenting the financial networks that supported slavery. He'd spent years tracking money, which banks financed slave purchases, which businesses insured human cargo, which families built their fortunes on human bondage. And the Ashford family was at the center of one of the largest networks in the South. Victoria's late husband had been a frontman for a consortium of northern and southern investors who financed slave trading operations across 3 states. When he died, Victoria had inherited not just the plantation, but access to all his records, all his contacts, all the evidence Elijah needed to expose the entire corrupt system. Getting into Willowbrook Plantation as a trusted field hand would have been impossible, but as Victoria's pet, her toy, her source of cruel amusement, he'd have access to the house, to her private spaces, to the very documents he needed. All he had to do was endure whatever horrors she had planned and wait for his moment. The wagon ride to Willowbrook was silent, except for the driver's occasional muttered curses. Ezra sat in the back, maintaining his vacant expression, even though his mind was racing. He'd studied Victoria Ashford for months through whispered slave networks. He knew about her cruelty, her games, her need to dominate and destroy. He was betting his life that she'd underestimate him so completely that she'd never see the truth. Victoria was waiting on the front steps, changed into a simpler day dress, but still radiating that cold, cruel beauty. "Bring him inside," she commanded, "to the parlor." The parlor was exquisite. Velvet furniture, oil paintings, a piano in the corner. Completely wrong for receiving a filthy field slave, which was exactly Victoria's point. She enjoyed violating the expected order of things. "Ezra," she said slowly, as if speaking to a child, "do you understand me?" He nodded, letting his head bob too much, like a simpleton eager to please. "Good. Here are the rules. You belong to me now. You will live in the small room off the kitchen. You will do whatever I tell you, whenever I tell you. If you please me, you'll be fed. If you displease me, you'll be punished. Do you understand?" Another exaggerated nod. Victoria circled him, her nose wrinkling at his appearance. "You're disgusting, truly repulsive, but that's precisely why you're perfect. Tomorrow we'll begin your training." What would you do in Elijah's position right now? Comment endure if you'd play along, or fight if you'd resist. Choose. The next 3 weeks were a study in psychological torture. Victoria's training was designed to break human dignity systematically. She made Ezra perform degrading tasks, crawling on the floor while she walked on his back, eating scraps from a dog bowl, standing motionless for hours while she and her friends mocked his appearance. She would command him to dance, to sing childish songs, to play the fool for her entertainment. And Elijah endured it all, never breaking character. But while Victoria thought she was breaking him, Elijah was learning everything he needed. The layout of the house, the location of her late husband's study, the schedule of the house slaves, the times when Victoria entertained guests versus when she was alone. And he was listening. Victoria had a habit of discussing business in front of Ezra, as if he were furniture. She assumed his simple mind couldn't possibly understand or remember complex financial discussions. So when her attorney visited to discuss investments, when her business partners came to review contracts, when she met with other plantation owners to coordinate slave purchases, Ezra was often in the room, standing in the corner, staring at nothing. But Elijah Freeman's brilliant mind was recording every word. He learned that Victoria was planning to expand her slave trading operations, that she had partners in Boston and New York who provided financing, that she was about to purchase 50 slaves from a ship arriving from Africa, despite the slave trade being technically illegal. He learned about forged documents, bribed officials, and a network of corruption that stretched from Georgia to Massachusetts. And he learned where she kept her late husband's ledgers, locked in a safe in her bedroom behind a painting of her wedding day. The breakthrough came on a rainy October evening. Victoria had hosted a dinner party, showing off her pet to her wealthy friends. She'd made Ezra perform his usual humiliations, and the guests had laughed until they could barely breathe. After they left, drunk on wine and cruelty, Victoria had gone to bed, leaving Ezra to clean up the mess. He was supposed to return to his small room after finishing. Instead, he waited. At 2 in the morning, when the entire house was asleep, Elijah Freeman dropped his disguise for the first time in 2 years. His movements became precise, calculated. The shuffling walk disappeared, replaced by quiet, efficient steps. The vacant expression sharpened into focused intelligence. He moved through the house like a shadow, his mind trained in mathematics and logic, calculating risks and probabilities with every step. Victoria's bedroom door was locked, but Elijah had spent weeks studying the house's security. He'd noticed that the window next to her balcony had a faulty latch. 10 minutes of careful work, and he was inside. Victoria slept soundly, exhausted from her evening of cruelty, a small smile still on her face. Elijah moved past her bed to the painting, a massive portrait of Victoria in her wedding dress, smiling adoringly at her much older husband. Behind it, just as he'd overheard in whispered conversations, was the safe. The combination would have stumped most people, but Elijah had listened to Victoria's attorney mention that her late husband had used his wedding date as the code. He'd heard Victoria mention the date multiple times in conversation, April 7th, 1843. 4743. The safe clicked open. Inside were ledgers, contracts, letters, bank documents, everything Elijah needed to prove the entire illegal operation. He couldn't take them all without Victoria noticing, but he didn't need to. His photographic memory, trained through years of academic work, allowed him to read and retain information with extraordinary accuracy. For the next 2 hours, while Victoria slept 15 feet away, Elijah read through years of financial records. He memorized names, dates, amounts, bank account numbers, shipping routes, forged customs documents. He photographed it all in his mind, creating a perfect mental archive of evidence that could destroy dozens of wealthy families and expose the northern financiers who publicly opposed slavery while privately profiting from it. He was closing the safe when Victoria stirred. Elijah froze, his heart hammering. If she woke now, if she saw him standing here with intelligence and purpose in his eyes instead of vacant confusion, everything would be over. Victoria mumbled something in her sleep, rolled over and settled back into deep breathing. Elijah waited 5 full minutes, then carefully closed the safe, replaced the painting, and slipped back out the way he'd come. By sunrise, he was back in his small room, once again Ezra the ox, drooling and vacant. But now he had everything he needed. The question was, how to escape? Running would be nearly impossible. Willowbrook was miles from any town, surrounded by patrollers and slave catchers who earned bounties for returned runaways. Even if he made it to Savannah, the ports were watched. His face, his real face, thin and intelligent, was on wanted posters across the South. No, Elijah realized, he couldn't run. He needed Victoria to send him away willingly. The plan that formed in his mind over the next days was risky, but it was the only option. He needed to make Victoria think he was dying, not from abuse, that would raise questions, but from natural causes, from his own weakness and stupidity. Elijah began to refuse food, but steadily, as if his simple mind had simply forgotten to eat. When food was placed in front of him, he would stare at it, confused, as if he couldn't remember what to do with it. He would take 1 or 2 bites and then wander away, distracted by something shiny. Within a week, he'd lost 15 pounds. His skin took on an unhealthy pallor. He moved more slowly, as if every action required immense effort. Victoria noticed, but not with concern, with irritation. "Stupid creature is wasting away," she complained to her housekeeper, an older slave named Ruth. "I paid good money for him, and now he's dying from his own idiocy." Ruth, who suspected there was more to Ezra than met the eye, played along perfectly. "He needs medicine, Miss Victoria. Doctor's medicine from town. Otherwise, he'll be dead within a month." "I'm not wasting money on a doctor for that thing," Victoria snapped. "There's a colored healer in Savannah," Ruth suggested carefully. "At the African church on West Broad Street. They tend to sick slaves for free. Could send him there for a few days, see if they can fix him." Elijah, standing in the corner, maintaining his vacant expression, felt a surge of hope. Savannah, the one place where he might be able to disappear into the free black community, where contacts from his previous life might still help him. Victoria considered it. If Ezra died, she'd lose her investment and her entertainment. If he recovered, she could continue her games. And sending a sick slave to the colored church would cost her nothing. "Fine," she said finally. "Send him tomorrow, but he comes back in 1 week, or I'll have every slave on this plantation whipped to find out who helped him run." The threat was real. Victoria would absolutely punish innocent people for Elijah's escape. He'd have to time this perfectly. The next morning, Ruth drove Elijah to Savannah in a small wagon. As soon as they were out of sight of Willowbrook, she looked at him sharply. "I don't know who you really are," she said quietly, "but I know you ain't no simpleton. I've seen you watching, listening. You're planning something." Elijah considered maintaining his disguise, but Ruth had earned honesty. Slowly, he let the mask drop, straightened his posture, focused his eyes, spoke in his real voice, educated and clear. "My name is Elijah Freeman. I'm a professor from Philadelphia. I'm a fugitive, and I've spent 2 years gathering evidence against Victoria Ashford and dozens of others who profit from slavery." Ruth's eyes widened. "Sweet Jesus! I need to get this information to abolitionists in the North. It could help end the financial networks that sustain this whole evil system." He paused. "But if I run now, Victoria will punish everyone at Willowbrook. I can't let that happen." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then, "The pastor at the African church, Reverend Moses Daniels, he's part of the Underground Railroad, been helping runaways for 20 years. If anyone can help you do this right, it's him." 3 hours later, Elijah sat in a small room behind the African Methodist Episcopal Church on West Broad Street, speaking with Reverend Daniels and 2 representatives from the American Anti-Slavery Society who happened to be visiting Savannah. "You memorized financial records?" one of them, a white Quaker named Thomas Garrett, asked incredulously. In response, Elijah began reciting names, dates, and figures, page after page of ledgers, contracts, and letters, all stored perfectly in his memory. He spoke for 2 hours straight, while the abolitionists frantically wrote everything down. When he finished, they stared at him in awe. "This is enough to prosecute dozens of people," Garrett said, "to expose northern banks and businesses, to prove that slavery isn't just a Southern problem, but a national conspiracy. But we need time to act on this information, to get warrants, gather witnesses, coordinate with authorities in multiple states. That takes weeks, maybe months. And I need to go back. If I don't return to Willowbrook, Victoria will kill innocent people." "That's suicide," Garrett protested. "If she discovers who you really are." "She won't. She can't imagine that someone who looks like me, acts like me, could possibly be intelligent. Her prejudice is my greatest protection." They argued for hours, but Elijah was firm. He would return to Willowbrook, continue his disguise, and wait. When the abolitionists had built their case, when warrants were issued and arrests imminent, they would send word. Only then would Elijah escape. "One more thing," Elijah said as they prepared to leave. "When you expose Victoria Ashford, I want the world to know how you discovered her crimes. I want everyone to know that the disgusting, simple-minded slave she tortured for entertainment was actually the man who brought her down." 7 weeks later, on a cold December morning, everything came to a head. Federal marshals arrived at Willowbrook Plantation with warrants for Victoria Ashford's arrest on charges of illegal slave trading, fraud, and conspiracy. Behind them were representatives from 3 northern banks looking to seize assets. Behind them were journalists from Boston and New York, ready to write the story that would scandalize 2 regions. Victoria was in her parlor when they arrived, with Ezra standing in the corner as usual, holding a tray of tea he'd been commanded to balance on his head for her amusement. "Miss Victoria Ashford," the lead marshal announced, "you're under arrest." Victoria's face went white, then red with rage. "On what charges? This is outrageous!" "Violation of the act prohibiting importation of slaves, conspiracy to commit fraud, and about 15 other crimes." The marshal held up papers. We have documentation of your entire operation, names, dates, financial records, everything." "That's impossible," Victoria hissed. "Those records are locked in my private safe. No one has access." "Actually," a new voice said from the doorway. Elijah Freeman stepped into the room, and for the first time in 2 years, he wore his real face. The transformation was staggering. The shuffling walk was gone, replaced by a professor's confident stride. The drool, the vacant expression, the hunched posture, all vanished. In their place stood a man of obvious intelligence and dignity, his eyes sharp and focused. "You," Victoria breathed, recognition dawning. "You're the fugitive from the posters, the Negro professor, but you look nothing like—" "Like Ezra?" Elijah smiled. "That's because Ezra never existed. I created him. The weight, the drool, the stupidity, all carefully constructed to hide in the last place anyone would look, in plain sight, right in front of you." Victoria's face contorted with rage and humiliation. You were in my house for months. I touched you, spoke in front of you." "And I listened to everything," Elijah said calmly. "Every business meeting, every illegal transaction, every corrupt deal. I memorized it all. Then I gave it to the American Anti-Slavery Society, and they've spent the last 2 months building a case against you and your partners." "But you're just a slave!" Victoria screamed. "You're property! Your testimony means nothing!" "I'm not a slave, Miss Ashford. I was born free. And my testimony, combined with the physical evidence these marshals found in your safe, means quite a lot." The marshals stepped forward with shackles as they placed them on Victoria's wrists, the same wrists that had commanded so much cruelty. Her face crumpled. "Please," she whispered, her beauty finally cracking to reveal the ugliness beneath. "I'll give you money, whatever you want. Just don't do this to me." Elijah looked at her with something that might have been pity, if she deserved it. "For 3 months, I ate from a dog bowl at your command. I endured your mockery, your cruelty, your games. I watched you torture others for your amusement, and through it all, you never once saw me as human, never once imagined that the disgusting creature you'd purchased for $35 might have a mind, a purpose, a soul." He leaned closer. "Your biggest mistake wasn't buying me, Miss Ashford. It was believing that ugly meant stupid, that fat meant worthless, that someone who looked like me couldn't possibly outsmart someone who looked like you." He straightened. "You lose." They led Victoria away in chains. Within a week, the story had spread across the country. The professor's disguise, how a fugitive scholar brought down a slave-trading empire. Newspapers ran illustrations of Elijah in both disguises, Ezra the Ox and Professor Freeman side by side. The trial exposed dozens of wealthy families, northern and southern, who'd profited from illegal slave trading. Banks lost their licenses, politicians resigned in disgrace. The financial network that sustained a portion of the slave trade was severely damaged. Victoria Ashford was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Her plantation was seized and sold. The slaves she'd owned were freed and given passage north, financed by the seized assets. And Elijah Freeman? He returned to Philadelphia, to his teaching, to his writing, but he never forgot the lesson of those 2 years. Sometimes, he told his students, the greatest weapon against injustice isn't force or anger. Sometimes it's patience, intelligence, the willingness to endure, to hide in plain sight, to let your enemies underestimate you so completely that they destroy themselves. "They thought I was nothing because of how I looked," he would say, "and that blindness was exactly what gave me power." Years later, when someone asked if he regretted those 3 months of torture at Victoria's hands, Elijah smiled, a genuine smile, free of pretense. "Every humiliation was worth it," he said, because it proved that human dignity isn't about appearance or status. It's about what you carry in your mind, in your heart, in your unbreakable will to resist. He paused. Victoria Ashford chose the ugliest slave as her toy, thinking she'd found someone she could break without consequence. Instead, she'd chosen her own destruction, and she never saw it coming. That's the power of underestimation, the danger of judging worth by appearance, the fatal flaw of cruelty that blinds itself to humanity. Victoria learned that lesson in a prison cell. Elijah taught it to generations of students who carried his story forward, long after both he and Victoria had turned to dust. Because some victories aren't won with violence, some battles are won with patience, intelligence, and the absolute refusal to let anyone, no matter how powerful, how beautiful, how cruel, define your worth. The plantation heiress chose the ugliest, fattest slave as her toy, and that choice cost her everything.